Did you know until a few days ago, really for the past couple months, Russia was sending something like 80 to 95 precision guided bombs from Russian territory into the Kharkiv region of Ukraine. But in the past several days, that number has decreased to about 50 to 60 per day. What has changed? Well, the main thing, the White House has at last given Ukraine permission to use a limited array of American weapons to hit Russians on Russian soil. And we're seeing that maybe this is having an effect already. But Ukraine is still limited and shackled in many other ways. Here's my daily report on Chicago's WGN Radio.
Little Joe Lindsley.
Joe Lindsley is quickly becoming an American treasure in broadcasting.
Welcome to Ukraine Bank.
Let's go to Ukraine and check in with Joseph Lindsley. And Joe, I hope it's been a relatively quiet 24 hours for you. What's the latest?
Hey, Bob, good afternoon from Lviv. And yeah, here in Lviv, it has been quiet. I mean, there still are power disruptions. That's becoming pretty common throughout most of the country, which is a sign of just how precisely the Russians had, in the past months had attacked Ukrainian infrastructure. So that's a real problem, and it's going to continue to be so. But on the positive side is it's also been pretty quiet in Kharkiv City. And, we for so much of the past months, Kharkiv City was heavily bombed by the Russians with ballistic missiles, with aerial guided precision guided bombs that the Russians launched from just over the border. And now we see a decline in that. And well, it's interesting, why might that be the case? As of late last week, the White House gave permission to Ukraine to use a limited sort of array of American tools and weapons to hit Russians on Russian soil. We can already see that whereas for the past month, there were about 80 to 95 of those precision guided bombs that the Russians were sending to Kharkiv region a day, that number in the past 3 to 4 days has been reduced to 50 to 60. So pretty significant. You see a significant change. And meanwhile, we have plenty of videos and evidence that the Ukrainians are hitting Russian anti-aircraft batteries, which sometimes the Russians use not to hit aircraft, but to hit civilians in Kharkiv City. Ukrainians have been taking these things out almost day by day now that they can use the American-made HIMARS to hit those places in the Belgorod region of Russia. So it does seem to be some measure of new kind of protection for Kharkiv. It still is very intense. The Russians have not made progress on the ground really in a couple of weeks. They've almost destroyed that city of Volchansk. Just at the border, but they have not penetrated the Ukrainian defensive lines that Ukrainians spent many months building up. So it looks like the Russians are suffering here in their attempt to take Kharkiv region and maybe even slipping and losing this. Still, we have to point out. I mean, I think that the headlines gave the sense that the U.S. lifted all restrictions on Ukraine to hit Russians near Kharkiv. Ukrainians are still forbidden from using the ATACMS, which are the long-range and highly precise missile systems from the U.S. They cannot use that anywhere if it might hit on Russian territory. The Ukrainians have been able to use this in the Crimean Peninsula to great effect, but they're still forbidden from using that to hit anything in Russia. And so I think part of what we look at, the Ukrainians have to prove that they can use these weapons well. Then there has to be proof that it's actually making things better. And I think for a lot of people in Washington, proof that Russia is not going to, do something crazy in response, that indeed Russia will be weakened rather than emboldened. And so that's kind of what everyone's watching. And I think Ukrainians are hoping that, before President Zelensky's peace conference in the middle of this month in Switzerland, that, they can have some good things to report. But so Kharkiv City, after all those stories we talked about the past month, no one's complacent, of course, but it is calmer days there right now.
I meant to bring this up a couple weeks ago, Joe. The governor's sister, Penny Pritzker, spoke at a news conference recently as a U.S. Special Representative to Ukraine. The former Commerce Secretary and the governor's sister talked about how the Pritzker's great-grandfather fled Kyiv 140 years ago, went to the United States to escape the Jewish persecution at the time, and eventually the family built a life in Chicago, and they are now one of the wealthiest folks in the entire country. Just another example of the connections people have, and another reason why it's important to keep this in the news. It's so easy to forget about what's going on daily there in Ukraine. But you hear stories like that about the connections, especially from the Chicago area all the time, don't you, Joe?
Yeah, and indeed, I know with the Pritzkers, I mean, I often hear their names in Kyiv because many elements of that family have come to Ukraine to volunteer, to donate, and to help. Probably in large part because of their connection. And you also another rich and powerful American who's here very often in a very quiet way is Howard Buffett, whose father is Warren Buffett, and he just believes in the cause. I know many Ukrainians who've got to know him well. He'll message Ukrainians, privately and say, hey, can I help you in your work? And so, without much fanfare, doing a lot, especially working on demining. And so, I think what I've seen here with, whether they're famous or not famous, but with so many of the people who've come in from around the world, they see something that's very clear cut. They see a mission that can help to give them purpose in their lives. And I think, a lot of them, and they really grow attached to this place. I just saw a video of a German girl who's learned perfect Ukrainian. And so when you create, things like that really give people a hope and encouragement here to know that they're not alone. And even as that happens, I mean, I was this morning in the city of Dnipro. So while I was talking about how Kharkiv is safe, Dnipro in south central Ukraine, Russians did bomb the city with ballistic missiles. These are missiles that can be launched from a further distance. And they hit a family house. And so it seems like everyone might survive, but they're all in the hospital and traumatized. And, this stuff almost does become so routine that it doesn't get mentioned. And, Gary Kasparov, the Russian dissident who I've mentioned before, he was on this great Ukrainian a podcast about Ukraine. It's based in Oxford called Silicon Curtain. You can look it up on YouTube. And he was saying, that even Israel and Gaza has dominated the news, but there are many days where the attacks are more intense on Ukrainians than they are even in Gaza. And that perspective is lost. Because people sort of get accustomed to it. And, today is the day, it's the United Nations Day to commemorate children who've been, wronged or, persecuted. It was a holiday that a day of commemoration started in 1982. And there are still so many Ukrainian children stuck in Russia, whether they're in occupied territories and then taken away into Russia. And so none of these problems have gone away. They still continue. And it's, this is what I think what President Zelensky, what he's hoping to do is in the lead up to that conference in the middle of this month is to show and to prove that Ukraine can get the job done. It's still a long way to go. But even as the Russian dissident Gary Kasparov said, he said, Europe really should be thanking Ukraine because Ukraine is doing what NATO was created to do. NATO was created to protect free Europe from Russia, and that's what Ukraine is doing now. And I think a lot of that can get missed because it's right now people can be in peace in Warsaw and Romania and Budapest because the fight is still here.
Good time to remember all that, especially this week with the commemoration of D-Day coming up. And I'm sure we'll be talking about that with you, Joe, and we'll check in with you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you for introducing Ukraine on your social media pages. That's very important that much more people can get more information about the situation here and how everybody can help Ukraine to stay stronger and to save all the world.
Что он сказал?
Well, which side are you on?
На чьей ты стороне?
Come on now. Oh, which side are you on?
На чьей ты стороне?